Sports presents Benning Bites with Damon Benning. Benning Bites with Damon Benning.
Another episode of Benning Bites. We got into yesterday. I blame Brian Christopherson because he's one of those guys that I really respect in the industry. I think he's pretty smart and a little deeper level thinker. We were talking about kind of coaching prowess in schools in the Big Ten, and we got to talking about Wisconsin. And I think it's widely known that obviously I think Coach Fickell and that staff was a good hire, and they're doing a good job. And we talked about how Coach Rhule was so secure and kind of who he is and what he brings to the table that when we got into a conversation a couple of months ago when I brought my son down, I don't even remember how the conversation started. He asked me about some other schools or something like that with visits, and somehow a couple of schools came up, and one of them was Wisconsin. And Coach Rhule said, immediately, he's like, Fick. He called him Fick, which got my attention, right? I'm a note taker. So I figured they have a decent relationship, and, he was very complimentary. He wasn't one of those guys that didn't badmouth him, didn't say any of this, that, and the other. He just was very complimentary. And it kind of took me back a little bit. I was like, gosh, I've been to a lot of schools, and it's kind of the first time, probably the second. There's another coach who was similar in his delivery and his affinity for other coaches around the country. But I was like, is he messing with me, or is he just that secure? And now that I've got a chance to kind of understand kind of how he works and, how he interacts with his family and how he wants to coach, I just think he's that secure. So we were talking about what are the similarities between the two, Coach Fickell and Coach Rhule. And I was talking about, having seen a couple of Wisconsin's practices, what I felt like some of the similarities are. And both very hands-on, right? Both coaches are supposed to have their emphasis, but then when you watch them, they're everywhere. Special teams, offense, defense, passing game, running game. Coach Rhule was hopping in over at tackling drills. And I felt like that was kind of impressive. And so Andrew asked me the question. He said, does that matter? Like, do coaches kind of gravitate towards their strengths or where your team has a weakness? So it opened up all these conversations about where head coaches kind of what they gravitate towards. And I kind of look at it like this. With some coaches, it depends on how they've hired, right? If they have complete confidence in an OC or DC and it's opposite their suggested background, they're probably not as hands-on-ish unless they're really trying to learn. That's the sign of good leadership, right? I felt like with Coach Rhule and Coach White, he was really paying attention to Coach White's style and delivery and what he was teaching, which let me know, at least maybe I'm speculating, but it let me know, gosh, yeah, he's pretty secure, not only in himself, but comfortable with the hire. So sometimes head coaches don't always gravitate towards what needs fixing. Sometimes they just want to learn. Sometimes coaches gravitate towards where they're comfortable, right? I've seen that a couple of times or two. And sometimes coaches just want to let the players know. I think all the time good head coaches want to let their players know that it all matters. I may have an emphasis. I may have an area of expertise. I may be the CEO. I may be an offensive guy. I may be a defensive guy, but it's all important to me. And so I really think that's one of those things that Coach Rhule was trying to do. Not only is he somebody that I think is a lifelong learner, but he also wants to know what's important. What's the fame story right here locally over the last 15 years? Oh, when Coach Pelini got involved with special teams, that's when special teams turned the corner. Or conversely, Coach Riley, he's not a defensive guy, so he's kind of letting his boy just do his own thing. He needs to get rid of his guy. And we hired Coach Diaco, right? That didn't turn out well. Coach Frost, offensive guy, made the famous or infamous statements, well, we hope that our defense is just good enough to get the ball back for our offense. And that kind of set precedent for how we felt about those sides of the ball. Even though over time, the 5 years of that tenure, you could easily make the case that Coach Chenander was the most consistent of the bunch. Now, to what degree you felt like that was functional is up to you, but I'm just my point in saying that is sometimes the coaches can let you know by what they're saying what's important to them. And I think for the good coaches, it all matters. They don't really gravitate towards one side of the ball or the other. We've seen this with NFL hires. Well, this cycle around, let's hire offensive-minded guys. This cycle around, let's hire defensive-minded guys. Now, I will say this, because Andrew asked me the question yesterday. Is there a difference between high school and college? And I say no. My history has been coaches that are heavily involved in all facets. Those teams are typically well-rounded. Those coaches that seem to have a preference on that side of the ball, it manifests itself. Like you can see it when you play them. I used Bellevue West as an example, right? Coach Huffman, very, very good offensive mind, right? His teams are offensive-minded. But what's the one thing Coach Huffman would tell you? Oh, you know what? I'd really – listen, we learn how to play good, sound defense to complement this high-flying offense. We're going to be in good shape. Coach Slamanji, defensive line guy, what's the first thing he spent time getting to know over at Omaha Westside? Offensive line. I use Coach Martin as an example. A guy that got back involved with offense even though he knew that he'd had an offensive coordinator for 22 years that he trusted, right? He's trying to change the image of just, hey, let's just run the ball and play good defense. And that became important to the kids. So I think good head coaches understand and recognize that it all matters, even though they have an emphasis. And this whole thing was birthed over what Nebraska feels like they can be good at the quickest. And I think even though on the offensive side of the ball they've been the most forthright, hey, fullbacks, tight ends, we want to run the ball, play action, we want QB run game. Like it has all the adjectives and descriptors, so we feel like we know that the offense is going to establish an identity. I'm trying to make the case that I think defense comes around first. They have more depth. I think they have more plug-and-play guys. I'm not going to make the case that it's easier to play defense because it isn't, but I do like the scheme as I'm understanding it on paper. I don't think you have to be the smartest and the most situationally prepared and know every nuance in order to get on the field. I think if you have a couple of basic principles in terms of what the 3-3-5 brings to the table, I think you're going to have your offensive or your athleticism have a chance to show. And I'm not saying one is easier than the other. I'm just talking about simple schematics. And I just get the sense in talking and being around this staff, I think if they had a choice, and this goes all the way back to what we talked about 3 or 4 weeks ago, about balance in the Big Ten. Who's kind of the most balanced? Who's not overly better on offense or overly better on defense? Or who? Because we've heard Coach Rhule and the staff talk about complementary football. Who's kind of the most complementary? And there were like 4 or 5 answers. I heard Illinois. I heard Minnesota. I heard Penn State. I heard Wisconsin when they were kind of in the heyday of when Nebraska joined the Big Ten. Not that that's past them, but right, they haven't been very good offensively as of late. Iowa, we know, is pretty one-sided. Michigan is probably the most balanced and highest producing. because they do it up front on both sides of the ball. Ohio State has been one-sided. It's been offensive-minded. So depending on which side of the division you're in or kind of what you gravitate towards or what your terms of balance are, you may have different answers. And I think the key is two things have to happen for Nebraska with a head coach if they want to get back to being relevant and playing for conference titles. Number one, the CEO has to embody all-encompassing. Offense, defense, special teams, the whole nine. Okay? You have to trust in the fact that if you've made good enough hires in some other areas, overseeing NIL, transfer portals, stuff like that, that you kind of let folks grow into their role, but still having your fingerprint on it. And you better be able to play good defense. Look at who's playing for Big Ten championships over the last handful of years. It has been teams that play the best defense. When Ohio State was playing for Big Ten championships, even with Zeke Elliott and Cardell Jones stepping in, and they were getting D linemen drafted, they were getting stops. They had to replace secondary and linebacking cores the last couple of years, and the defense slipped a little bit, right? It wasn't quite as plug and play. Meanwhile, quietly, when Penn State was sneaking in there playing for a Big Ten championship, they were winning with defense. They held Ohio State to scoring in the teens in Happy Valley and got a field goal late to win. They were playing good defense. Michigan playing good defense. I think we're not talking enough about the black shirts. Now, that doesn't mean Coach Rhule has to be heavy-handed and be hovering over the defensive side of the ball. But I do feel like if he lets those guys know it's important and it matters, I think you kind of give yourself a chance. Now, again, it's different, I think, with the NFL because it is so complicated and there are so many schemes that it's hard for a coach to be good on the offensive and defensive side of the ball unless he's elite, an elite level head coach. So you get the labels, oh, he's an offensive guy, he's a defensive guy. In college, in high school, I think if you want to win, try to avoid those labels. That's general rule of thumb. May not be lock, stock, take it to the bank, but it's what I think Nebraska needs in terms of leadership, especially if you take a look at the past 20 years. You've been easily able to label which side of the ball the coach has a strength on, and look at what's happened with that side of the ball. Get a defensive-minded guy in Bo Pelini, and you can't score enough points in 09 and 10. You get an offensive guy like Callahan, and you couldn't get enough stops. You get an offensive guy like Mike Riley, and we had two coordinators in 4 years and a guy that he didn't even know that he hired, so you didn't trust that hire. Then you get Coach Frost, an offensive guy who outwardly said, if we're just good enough on defense to get the ball back from my offense. See, that didn't work either because then we couldn't appreciate the nuances that they were making, especially as the defense got a little consistent and their defensive efficiency escalated in 3 years, just a short 3 years. And when it went south, the last year it was, see, I told you. Because we spoke it into existence with what we expected from the get-go. And now we get a guy that appears to be pretty multifaceted. Likes offense, likes defense. He's got a good background in both. Is willing to understand what's going on with hiring somebody that he really didn't have a tremendous pre-existing relationship before in Coach White. Don't undersell overseeing in its totality. It doesn't have to be if you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. You can be 7s across the board on a scale of 1 through 10 and have it be plenty good. You just don't want to be a 10 in one area and a 2 in another. That, my friends, is a recipe for disaster. However you get us, continue to do so. Apple, Google, Spotify. Make sure you tune into the show in just a few minutes at Coffee and Cream. Give my man Andrew Rogers a follow at Andrew Rogers CC. That's another episode of Benning Bites.